I think borders, and there's some on the picture, are increasingly represented as a problem in a lot of the discussion today. A problem for nations, or a problem of nations, and then a problem for the people who live within them. On the one hand, you have people arguing for greater openness and porous borders over which people and goods can pass without hindrance. Though I think often that the real thrust of their argument is really more negatively directed against those who they accuse of seeking to defend closed societies. People sort of argue that the existence of borders and fences creates artificial divisions between people who would otherwise be sort of together, either in some kind of natural or social sense. So on the one hand, the border is seen as creating the xenophobe and the racist. On the other hand, it creates the excluded other, the mirror image of the xenophobe, the migrant, the refugee, and the asylum seeker. And borders, too, are seen as a legacy of colonial settler history as enforcing and creating inequality between people. So the future is held up as one without borders. Nations and borders are seen as being things of the past, no longer relevant or appropriate for the 21st century. And this is an argument that's been made with increasing force and influence since the First World War, the League of Nations, picking up steam since the Second World War, United Nations, and really taking off with the end of the Cold War, financial globalization, mass immigration, international terrorism, and maybe above all, the existential threat to the world itself, that is climate change. So on the one hand, the dark past, colonialism, racism, and war, and on the other hand, the bright future of global cities, diversity, and world peace. The future is seen as open, the nation as closed and inward-facing, a structure which only came into existence to perpetuate and entrench the power and privilege of elites, of men, of white men, of citizens who enjoy special rights and benefits denied to non-citizens. And those who argue for borders, brave souls, the populists as they're now normally labelled, often rightly, however, deny the accusation of xenophobia and racism by making an argument that good fences make for good neighbours. National borders should be accepted for what they are because they reflect and protect a particular national culture, which is an argument, I suppose, which can be reduced to saying Britain for the British, France for the French, Israel, maybe more contentiously, for the Jewish. All of which poses the question, in what is it that Britishness or Jewishness consists? Is it something in the blood, a birthright that you can't get rid of, or something that can be acquired in the way one can pick up and learn a new language? Much of the hostility to nations and borders and to popular nationalism is informed by the influential post-war view that nations are cultural artefacts created around the end of the 18th century, and reflecting an ideology, nationalism, that would end up in the racial worldview of Nazi Germany. Benedict Anderson, who I'm going to look at in some detail, states in his introduction to his Imagined Communities that no one disputes this, that nations were created at the end of the 18th century, except for nationalist ideologues in particular countries, particularly bad countries, I suppose he imagines. But he just takes it as objective fact that nations were created then. Which is something I want to question a little bit in the course of this talk. Were they really created at the end of the 18th century? Or were they not, in some cases at least, around earlier? At the very least, there's a possibility or direction of travel, which becomes an endpoint much clearer when they get there. And I think I also want to question the idea that nations are cultural artefacts, which is, I suppose, to ask the question, what's the right balance when we think about this between seeing a nation as made, or made up, if you like, or seeing it as found and real and revealed? Is it completely artificial or utterly natural? And in general, I think there is a dismissal today in a lot of discussion of what we don't like as being just a cultural artefact, just a social construct. When many such dismissals, I would argue, actually tell us nothing about the topic we're looking at, because there's very little in this world that is not a social construct. So in looking at this question for the book I'm writing on borders as well, I found that there's just a deluge of research papers and books out there arguing that borders are just social constructs, by which they tend to mean, I think, not real. Borders are made up entirely and in no way natural. But I think borders weren't invented in that sort of way by people or by politicians or by national elites. I think I'm tempted to argue sort of the other way around on the question and say that politics is made possible in some sense by the existence of borders. If politics is an activity proper to public life in a city-state or a nation-state, then it's to do with being a citizen, a member of a body politic, and divided off by borders from both private life and from the politics of other communities and nations. So politics sort of relies on those borders and distinction, but it also is a practice that tries to find ways of bridging or transcending divisions of interest. So politics sits along those lines. In any event, whatever you make of that, the world of border studies today is thoroughly postmodern. To quote one recent literature review of geographical border studies, it is now anti-deterministic, anti-essentialistic, and not focused on the line per se. Instead, borders are now predominantly critically investigated as differentiators of socially constructed mindscapes and meaning. Borders are not seen as being real, they're denied, if you like, in the name of no borders. But I don't think that opposition, which you hear a lot of between borders and no borders, is a genuine opposition at all. It's a sort of sterile counterposition rather than a transformative or illuminating relationship. I think it's only against the horizon afforded by the border that the space beyond it and the space inside it becomes illuminated and becomes somewhere that can be reached or somewhere that can be stayed in. Borders are never then sort of fixed points of inclusion and exclusion as is often imagined. It doesn't make sense just philosophically, logically, to talk about opposing borders to no borders because it's borders on which oppositions turn and rest. I think we should also bear in mind that what society constructs is neither just nor mere. The institutions that society constructs express and mediate actual relationships between people. And the idea of a citizen, sure, is a social construct, but it's not an invention, but something that expresses an actual relation of equality between citizens who are on the same level. Borders aren't just a social construct you can sweep away, kind of a flick of the pen. Nations and the people they represent are not easily dismissed on the basis of exclusivity alone. Borders, nations and peoples are social constructs, but they are the society that has been constructed. And they've got maybe more of a claim to be real than anything else. And I think also that the nation has to have a border. It becomes identifiable and self-identifiable on the basis of a bordering distinction between what's outside. It can defend itself, it can administer itself, and it can secure itself, and it can be placed into a relationship of internationalism with other nations with their borders. That relationship is one of freedom, right, which can be a struggle either way, but it's a relationship that also entails the possibility of mutual security. I think there's an analogy with the way the individual self, I'm harking back to some of last year's discussions, where the individual self develops within a private life within the context of a family. So the political self can develop within the security and familiarity of the nation. That's the introduction. Anderson, I'm going to look a bit about Benedict Anderson and just go through some of his arguments, and maybe in the discussion we can pick up on this, but I just wanted to get a common understanding of what he's saying. So Anderson argues that the nation is an imagined community. Its nation's nationality, nationalism are cultural artefacts coming into existence at the end of the 18th century, coterminous with the end of divine monarchy and with the rise and dominance of print capitalism. Its full definition is that the nation is imagined as limited, as sovereign, and as a horizontally organised community of comradeship, solidarity. For Anderson, the nation is a cultural artefact, a product of early modernity or the Industrial Revolution. It's also a product, interestingly, of the New World. He has in mind the United States, of course, and the influence on the French Revolution, but also South America. He sees nationalism as being imported into Europe through the French Revolution. And an abiding image, I think, of the birth of nationalism, often cited as that of General Kellerman at the Battle of Valmy in 1792, who, confronted with the superior discipline of Prussian troops, rallied his citizen soldiers to victory, raising his hat aloft on the point of his sword, crying, "Vive la nation!" Anderson's... Yeah. Darkness fell. Is the mic still working, please? Yeah. So Anderson's, I think, very influential argument is that before modernity, borders were open, much more open and fluid. Attachments were local, and religion spoke to universal ends. The mic has now gone off. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah. All right.
Record them.
To give some examples, the borders of contemporary Britain and France, which may seem completely sort of natural to us now, didn't take the form that they have now until really quite late on. In the Middle Ages, half of France was English, with England's reach extending all the way to the Pyrenees. Monarchies were defined in terms of a high centre, and away from the centre started to fade, this is Anderson's argument, fade imperceptibly into each other. People were very largely tied to the place of their birth, which was a village and not a country, and if they did imagine themselves to be part of a larger community, then that community was a universal one of Christendom, a kingdom without ends. For nationalism to be possible, Anderson identifies three cultural roots, three precursors. Firstly, the loss of the authority of sacred texts, the Bible, which ended Christendom and the Islamic Ummah, transcontinental sodalities, as he terms them, brotherhoods, which that privileged access to universal truth fell away through the Reformation. Secondly, the loss of the authority of the divine monarch, who had also been conceived of as having privileged and unique access to being and to truth. That high centre is lost. And thirdly, there's a disruption of an understanding of temporality, in which, to quote, cosmology and history used to be indistinguishable, but the idea of human life being rooted firmly in the very nature of things, giving certain meaning to the everyday fatalities of existence, death, loss and servitude and so on, these ideas change and we get a completely different understanding of time. So this sort of Enlightenment breakthrough is really understood by Anderson as an attack on religious belief in the West, the collapse of universalism into the divided and divisive particularity of national identity. Why? He identifies two kind of drivers for these big changes. One, the effect of the exploration of the non-European world. So this is kind of a key point for him, why he talks about the New World, is that he gives an example somewhere about Marco Polo going to China, and he starts to, in his diaries, Marco Polo is making a distinction between our Christian festival of Easter and their Chinese festivals, and then starts to characterize Christianity as being the truest of four religions. I can't remember what they are that he's got on offer, but Anderson talks about this as in a way prefiguring the nationalists' claim that our nation is the best. So Christianity is the truest, our festivals are like that, their festivals are like that. So it's the exploration of the world out there in this understanding that starts to give people a sense of us, and as soon as we've got a sense of them as being different, we seek to colonise them. And the second driver Anderson identifies as a gradual demotion of the sacred language itself. With what he calls print capitalism, Latin gets rapidly demoted from its position as an international sacred language and displaced by local vernaculars. So the Bible is written in German by Luther, by Tyndale and so on, in English. Dante writes in Italian, and you see these texts being put into the vernacular and more widely distributed by the technologies of print capitalism and the desire of publishers to make money, no doubt. He sees it as a part of a larger process in which sacred communities, which were previously integrated by sacred languages, were gradually fragmented, pluralized, and territorialized. So some of these changes are driven by Latin being made more remote from everyday life. The Reformation is a huge push, obviously, Luther's Bible, for the ascendancy of the vernacular, and you have a mass audience for Bible translations. And you get a slow spread of particular vernaculars, languages, as instruments of enabling administrative centralization by wannabe absolutist monarchs. It's easier to administer your territory if you've got everybody speaking a common language. There are other theses on this. In his sort of trilogy, recent trilogy, Francis Fukuyama, I think it's in The Origins of Political Order, talks about what is distinctive in terms of the nation as it emerged in Western Europe and compares them to Middle East, India and China. And his argument is that in Western Europe what's striking is not the strength of the nation, if you like, but it's the political fragmentation of Europe after the universalism of the Roman Empire that has done the fragmentation that makes it possible for individual nations to arise. There's real political weakness across Western Europe and a strong church which is able to put in place feelings of solidarity and allow the rule of law. Frank mentioned canon law, allows that rule of law to be embedded in European society before democracy and before accountable government, but also before the modern state-building process itself. So there's something there beforehand in terms of certain ideas about fellow humanity and the existence of a rule of law, which is something Anderson doesn't talk very much about, actually, which I think is a sort of an interesting blind spot in a way. He operates with something Frank alluded to as well, with a distinction between bad nationalism, if you like, and good nationalism. So bad nationalism he calls official nationalism and imperialism, as opposed to largely spontaneous popular nationalisms of the 19th century. So the official nationalism is a reaction against the popular nationalism. It's kind of a power grab by conservative reactionary forces who think they're losing their grip on society post the French Revolution. It's aristocratic, dynastic power groups that are really fearful of marginalisation that push an official nationalist line. Whereas the popular vernacular nationalism, I think this is Tosca, can speak in the language of love, of folk music, poetry and song, whereas the official one talks about a language of blood, rootedness, fixity and nature, if not race. So to summarise, I think I read Anderson as saying that the main causes of nationalism are the declining importance of privileged access to particular script languages such as Latin because of mass vernacular literacy. There's a waning of the authority of divine right and hereditary monarchy, and the emergence of print capitalism, the standardization of national calendars, clocks and languages. Newspapers is the main example always used of this. Everybody can be reading the same newspaper at the same time, although they never meet. So the imagined community then is a group who are able to self-identify on the basis of being able to communicate with each other in a mass circulation national language. a development driven, Anderson would argue, in some sense by capitalism, and then these emergent nations, nationalisms, are open to capture by reaction post the Enlightenment. So, if that's Anderson's thesis, some questions I wanted to throw out there to consider, which we could maybe come back to. And then I want to go ahead and look at some of the contemporary debate, bring Anderson up to date if you like, and look quickly at the books some of you may have looked at on the reading list. One by Zizek, the name of which is completely escapes me. Little thin book. Double Blackmail. Yeah, that's right. And then one by Beck, his last work, the Metamorphosis book. But I know Josie's going to talk more about that one tomorrow. So the questions that Anderson was trying to answer were, if the nation is objectively modern, why does it appear subjectively antique to nationalists, with their sort of misty-eyed mythology stretching all the way back to a beginning? Why is there this formal universality of nationality as a socio-cultural concept? So why is everybody into nationality? And two, thirdly, why has it got such political power? The question that really sort of grabs him is, why will people die for a nation? Why does nationalism have such political power when it seems to him to have such philosophical poverty and even incoherence? So, what is it that would grab people about this? It's not a proper sort of setup or argument that would be compelling. Well, I mean, if nations are invented and imagined, then partly I think some of them have been invented longer than others. Some of you may have ploughed your way through Robert Coombs' recent history of England, which I think I might put on the reading list as well. But I got as far as page 57 at least, and then he was arguing that in terms of writing a history of England, it was English historians, he argues, in the 12th century that created the very idea of a national history in the first place, as being the and they articulated it in terms of it being the continuing history of people in a place. And even earlier than that, some historians had tried to trace England or Albion back to the founding myth of Brutus fleeing Troy, trying to hook themselves back into that Roman foundational myth. So these guys are trying to write their own Aeneid, if you like, finding an origin from which to trace back the evolving narrative of their island story. So that had been going on. If it's an imagined community, it had been going on earlier than the 18th century in some cases, at least in the English case. And I think that sense of continuity of a coming into being over time in a place can't have happened overnight. That doesn't make sense. It must have been developing. Now, whatever sort of impetus Kellerman's hat at Valmy may have had on the spread of nations across Europe and the world in the 19th century, these ideas were ones that had been a long time developing. John Locke, of course, more than 100 years before the Declaration of Rights of Man, had very much influenced its formulation, which, don't need to remind you, states the principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No body nor individual may exercise any authority which does not proceed directly from the nation. Now, this question about national identity, this being national, is whether it is invented or real. Anderson's troubled by the supposed objective lateness of the nation, but he is able, I think, partly to be able to make the nation relatively late, only because he places it after the development of national languages, which I think rather begs the question. What drove the development of these widely spread national vernaculars, demotic? If people weren't together already, then, this must be a point at which they self-identify in a significant enough way, a significant enough number for it to count as being a nation. What was it that weakened the authority of the church? He doesn't really have an answer to that question. Why were the monarchs and territorially based rulers able to come out of that structure? Luther's princes and so on, why were they challenging and breaking through this cover of universal Christendom. We've discussed these questions before, I think, but let me just link it as a provocation to the development of the self. So the ongoing emergence and deepening of self-consciousness and subjectivity, which, as it develops, seeks to find answers to existential questions on the inside through a process of self-examination rather than on the outside given to us in the world. And I think the development of the nation is sort of comparable to that, or it's a useful thing to think about. It's the subjective deepening of a living together and the furnishing of a narrative that explains that and plays it back to us, that fits, the narrative fits with our belonging in a place. So in both cases, that subjective deepening is about an increasing ability to self-determine at the level of individual political and moral autonomy, but also at the level of the nation-state's ability to self-determine. And the nation then becomes, if you see it that way, it becomes, I think, it's sort of the historical identity and sense of abiding loyalty that unites us in a political body. Because we define the nation as a shared territory that we, the citizens, live in, it follows that we are able to make laws for us, laws that suit us and make sense to us. And laws that are, because they're territorially circumscribed, laws that we can change, as opposed, if you like, to religious laws, which would go right across the process and be eternal. Territorially derived laws are open to change by the people who made them in that shared territory with a common language. And those things together, the shared territory, the common language, and the rule of secular law, come together to allow us to relate as equals, as neighbours within a community, not as members of, and it transcends questions of religion or race. So the United States, Frank mentioned this morning, yes, it's obviously a product of late modernity, and it seems to fit Anderson's thesis very well in that sense, except that it did come into existence as a colony, in a sort of positive sense of colony. Let's go and colonise, well, not for the Indians, but that's fraught, isn't it? But people went to found a new home, a new settlement, a New England, and it was a foundation, and a religious foundation at that, of settlers who came to a place to make a home there together. And the United States has been successful. It's not, although it's a federal system, it is a nation state. It's been a sort of successful extended working out of a Republican political project that you can argue traces back to, and self-consciously in many cases, traces back to Roman and Greek ideas of civic citizenship and to the political experience of the late Roman Republic as captured by Cicero. Does this mean that the US is an invention, that it's made up? Right? We're just going to make up a story about Republican roots and a city on a hill and so on? Maybe, but if it was made up, it was certainly not just made up, but it was made up over many, many generations and a long tradition and inheritance of a certain understanding of politics, a certain way of being together, which seemed to trump others. America, although federal, is a nation state, and it's a successful product, or maybe the only successful product of an outcome of an experiment in which, given a shared territory, given a legal system, given a common language, the American people were able to, in spite of all their differences, in spite of slavery and the Civil War and religious differences, they've been successfully able to be together as fellow citizens in a settlement to which they owe a loyalty that can transcend even the differences of the Civil War. So their borders speak to the prior attachment of the people, not to the diktats of some transnational bureaucracy. Now, this settlement may be in question today, and we can look at whether or not contemporary America has that abiding sense of loyalty and attachment to a degree sufficient enough to get it through contemporary differences. And we can look, I think, usefully about the attacks on the sense of loyalty through cosmopolitanism, identity politics, and whatever the third thing was flagged up this morning, regionalism by Frank. But it's definitely a weakening. A country that has to impose a Patriot Act might have a bit of a problem with patriotism rather than something being something spontaneous, but that's something we can discuss. I'm going to very briefly, I don't know if anybody's ever read the historian Anthony Smith. He has a counter view to Anderson. He sees the nation and nationalism as having much deeper roots in an ethnic substratum. He very carefully immediately runs away from that word ethnic to define it as being nothing to do with race, not to speak to genetic explanations, but his definition of a nation, and I'll just put this out there so you can compare it to Anderson's. For Smith, the nation is a named population sharing an historic territory, common myths and historical memories, a mass public culture, a common economy, and common legal rights and duties for its members. And different ethnies are defined as named units of population with common ancestry, myths, and historical memories, elements of shared culture, some kind of link with an historic territory, and some measure of solidarity, at least among their elites. So he thinks that goes further back than the 18th century, that it's, again, a sort of gradual, extended, lengthy, provisional, and ultimately unfinished answer to a question that's posed when people come to live together. Is that how will we live together? And the nation is an evolving and provisional answer to that question. To bring it up to date, kind of quickly, and then I'll stop. I think the discussion today has moved between that sort of debate that Anderson and Smith were having. And Smith wrote quite a lot of books trying to rebut Anderson's arguments. I think today the cultural and political elites have even more sort of lost the connection to the past. So Anderson was sort of separating the nation out from the past. It sort of came into existence late. But now I think people are even more unrooted, and it's particularly really speeded up in the last 20, 30 years. In the cultural, political, intellectual elites, on the other hand, a lot of people continue to live in nations and continue to have attachments to their neighbours and homes and ways of life and culture and language. They haven't lost that sense of continuity. So that it's resulted in a marked disconnect between the experience of national elites and the people. And that marked disconnect is reflected in the relative absence of the people from the stage of their own nation-state politics. And so, if you take a sort of broad brush view on it, you can caricature the leaders and cultural elites of some of the, certainly the older nations in the West, as self-defining, unhelpfully and confusingly, they self-define as anti-elitist and anti-nation state. So they are expected, think of Brexit, they are expected to be giving national leadership and reflecting the interests of the people in a nation. The last thing they actually want to do. Instead, they're pro-diversity, pro-globalization, pro-immigration, concerned about climate change and so on. They believe the nation-state has a limited, or at least a reduced relevance to the contemporary moment. And they react certainly very strongly against any expressions of nationalism or patriotism internally, and make a clear distinction, like today's contemporary political philosopher David Baddiel, and make a clear distinction between the soft, watered-down, vulnerable patriotism as opposed to anything that smacks of any form of cultural national superiority. So to quote from the Beck book, the nation-state has to go. The insight, I quote, the insight that no nation-state can cope alone with the global risk of climate change has become common sense. From here arises the recognition of the fact that the principle of national sovereignty, independence and autonomy is an obstacle to the survival of humankind, and that the declaration of independence has to be metamorphosed into the declaration of interdependence, cooperate or die. He sees the metamorphosis, Beck sees the metamorphosis of the world as involving a transition from the nation-state to the city. In fact, I think the movement, the real historical movement, I think, is better understood as the ongoing slowness of the nation to emerge in the political form that is best suited to democracy. It's striking. There's a big review of nationalism in The Economist around Christmas. It's really striking that up until 1940 there were about 80 independent nation-states in the world, and from then onwards it's sort of rocketed. There's a hockey stick curve. We're up to 200 nations very quickly. So most nations in the world come into existence during or after the Second World War in the sweeping process of decolonisation, only to come into existence to meet the arguments of the sort of intellectual leaders of the world that it's time for them to cooperate or die, almost the moment after they've been born, which is sort of ironic and sad for these former colonies. Zizek makes a similar sort of argument that it all used to be about colonisation, and then the nation-state came along, and now it has to go. The only reason we have nation-states is because of a legacy of slave trades, slave trading and colonial occupation. Beck echoes him. The birth of the European nation-states would not have been possible without the exploitation of humans and material resources within the colonised territories. The colonies constituted laboratories of the future, and what would subsequently be implemented in the European nation-states was tested. So much pushing the Anderson argument about the new world creates a model for nation-states which is brought back to the old world. They've really pushed on in a sort of a vulgar way this idea, and so the nation-state is nothing more than the legacy of colonialism, and now needs to be got rid of. So, where does that leave us today? There are, I think, sort of sterile battle lines being drawn up between the enlightened cosmopolitan. Beck calls him Homo cosmopoliticus, and on the other hand, the Neanderthal, and he's explicit about that. He sees there are two warring world views coming into opposition at the moment, and we are being forced to choose. It's nation-state or globalism. And I think the battle lines have become sort of overly heated because the oppositions between universalism or internationalism and nationalism have become abstract and hollowed out, rather than being seen in any kind of relationship. It's a similar problem with borders. In reality, I don't think the universal can ever be at odds with the particular. It's not, the universal is not something over there that you get to when you leap beyond the particular and transcend the limits of the particular into the sort of utopia of the universal. Rather, the particular and the universal always have to go hand in hand, don't they? I think there's a difference, because there is a difference between things that actually are distinct. That difference between things that are distinct allows us to compare and contrast them, rather than put them opposite each other. Many, I think, are growing concerned about the increasing polarisation, rightly so, concerned about the increasing polarisation of politics, as echoing the distinction made between friend and foe by the Nazi political theorist Carl Schmitt. And certainly you might read Donald Trump as sort of echoing this language. I don't know how much Carl Schmitt reads, that Donald Trump reads, but this week he was talking about the European Union as one of his greatest foes, rating it ahead of Russia and China. Though he did immediately go on to explain what he meant was that although China's a foe, he said I only mean it economically. It doesn't mean they're bad people. It doesn't mean anything. It means they are competitive. They want to do well, and we want to do well. So what people will see is Donald Trump's echoing of Schmidt is in fact a wish for assured mutual success rather than anything else. And as Frank noted at the end of his recent book on populism in Hungary, it's actually contemporary liberals who have taken Schmidt's friend-foe distinction to heart. At the end of that book, he quoted a Daily Beast headline from the American election: "Donald Trump can't merely be defeated, he and his deplorables must be crushed." And I think it's this kind of thinking that underlies Beck's distinction between Neanderthal man and Homo cosmopoliticus. Beck sees the future as leading, and maybe this is sort of a wish fantasy here, he sees the future, saw the future, as leading to a struggle between a generation less in the West and a generation more in the developing world. To quote him again, "What is already becoming visible today will in future perhaps emerge more dramatically, the outlines of a new global redistribution struggle. On one side, the defensive trying to hold on to the remnants of affluence with laws and frontier barriers. The others setting out charging against these same frontiers with all their strength, driven by the hope of a better life. The result, a conflict-laden interaction, one fraction of the global risk generation against the other." And Zizek follows the same line of thinking. He talks about a coming struggle between the excluded and the included, the destructive potential if the enclosure of the commons in new forms of apartheid by global capitalism is allowed to continue, with the creation of a radical class division across the entire globe. So I want to end on that sort of note with we're in a strange position of having anti-national, anti-elitist, national elites today who see the world in black and white, Manichaean, good and evil terms, whereas in a way that seems to be precluding the possibility of discussion and debate and thinking about different conceptions of the nation. On that basis, I think we have to think about trying to defend some of the pre-political foundations of the sovereign democratic community, and as we defend or seek to defend aspects of private life from intrusion by the state. So I think we need to find ways to defend the life of the nation against transnational actors, but not see this transnational versus national as a friend-foe distinction. The transnational doesn't exist. It's not an imagined community, it's an entirely made-up fictional community. It's a pious wish more than it is a reality. It's got no more reality to it than the jihadist fantasy of a global Ummah ranged up against the colonialist West, and I think the two conceptions bear useful comparison. It still is the case, and it will always be the case, that it is the nation alone that provides any real basis for democracy. And we have to reject these sort of false dichotomies between the supposed wisdom of the transnational expert, who is nothing more than the contemporary form of Plato's navigator at the head of the ship of state, on one hand, and the alleged ignorance of Neanderthal masses on the other. There is no such thing as a transnational expert. He only comes into view once you deny the wishes and the experience of people who live in nations. To take another axis in the contemporary cultural wars, there's often talked about being a divide and debate between the traditional and the post-traditional. Hey, look at me, I'm post-traditional, aren't I hip? Again, this is an entirely false opposition based on a denial of reality. There's no transformative relationship or any relationship at all between the post-traditional and the traditional, merely a rejection of the traditional. There's a real relationship between the traditional and the original, right? And against that horizon, and it's against that backdrop of the traditional that originality becomes possible. Right? You're enabled to be original to the extent that there is a tradition that you're reacting through and against. Both are aspects of the same process, which is the process by which the individual stands out through his membership of an historical group. And it's these traditions, ways of life, ways of being together, pre-political loyalties, that I think need to be defended. And the new nations, the majority of the new post-war nations, I think deserve a chance to develop their own national and democratic traditions. And I think they've, Anderson to one side, I think a lot of nations of the world have got a lot of history in front of them, rather than being something that we should see as having had their day.